to a special episode of the War on the Rocks podcast and Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Usha Sahay, the managing editor of War on the Rocks, and I'm here with a fantastic crew in Austin, Texas. We're here to talk about the legacy of Vietnam for national security policymaking and American society more generally. So I'm going to go around the room and introduce our guests, starting with my excellent co-host, Will.
Hi, this is Will Inboden. I'm the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas, Austin, and more importantly for our purposes, the editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review.
Hi, I'm Mark Lawrence. I'm an associate professor of history here at UT Austin, and I have written a good deal about Vietnam, including a couple of books on the subject.
Hi, I'm Aaron O'Connell. I'm a military historian here at the University of Texas and a faculty fellow at the Clements Center for National Security.
Hi, I'm Celeste Ward-Gaventer. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security.
All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for being here. We're really excited for this conversation. Will, I want to kick it off with you. Tell us a little bit about your experience with the legacy of the Vietnam War during your time making policy.
Thanks, Usha. So going back to my time working on the George W. Bush administration National Security Council staff, I was there on the NSC staff from 2005 to 2007, which many of our listeners will immediately recognize were some of the worst years of a difficult war, the Iraq War, but also during the time when the surge was developed. And coming into the Bush NSC, I quickly realized that the Vietnam overhang, even though we didn't talk about it a lot initially, was inescapable. And there was a real concern within the administration that this not become Bush's Vietnam, not become another Vietnam. And even President Bush himself was mindful of that. So one of the things that we started working on, was looking what are some lessons or insights from Vietnam on any range of dimensions, civil mill, counterinsurgency, eroding congressional support, eroding popular support. And I remember doing a number of small studies and memos on those particular topics of trying to be mindful of are there some useful takeaways from Vietnam. And where this became especially gnarly, if you will, is after President Bush announces the surge in January of 2007, those of us inside the administration, we all knew that this was a long shot, a gamble, but thought that it was the least bad option. We've got a forthcoming book coming out on this called The Last Card on the Deck. That was Condi Rice's words to President Bush, Mr. President, these are last card on the deck. And even though we were reasonably confident we had come up with the best option of a set of bad options for in theater on the ground, we also had a real acute problem with eroding congressional and public support. And so President Bush then wanted to do a series of speeches trying to shore up public support, especially because we were concerned that Congress was going to cut off funding. The Democrats had just taken control of Congress in November of 2006, and that was a real possibility. And so vivid memory, in the summer of 2007, President Bush gives a speech to the Veterans of Foreign Wars annual convention. And in that speech, he wanted to warn about what he saw, and I think rightly, as one of the unfortunate legacies of Vietnam, which is after the American pullout, that eventually contributes directly or indirectly to the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia and the total carnage in Cambodia, but also to once the communists take over, horrible human suffering for the South Vietnamese, many thousands of them killed in death camps and what have you. So President Bush wanted to make the warning in this VFW speech about look. When our nation pulls out too early or yanks support from an unpopular war, even worse things can happen. Now, I'm one who thinks we never should have gotten into Vietnam in the first place. Okay, so I don't want to go too far in this Vietnam revisionism stuff. But on that particular question of 1972, 73, 74, 75, I thought there was an important lesson. But it didn't work at all. The speech didn't. And I realized it was a couple of reasons. One, people still weren't seeing improvements on the conditions in Iraq. Two, they, at that point, didn't regard President Bush as a credible messenger. But three, he was trying to do a double move there. One, he was trying to persuade most Americans that the conventional understanding of Vietnam is wrong. And that's hard for history professors to do. That's hard for presidents to do in the abstract, but especially when we're in the middle of this very unpopular war in Iraq. So he was first trying to convince them that their conventional understanding of Vietnam is wrong. And second, tried to convince them that their conventional understanding of Iraq was also wrong, and we needed to stay the course with this new strategy. And I know the topic of the podcast here is not the surge, but rather Vietnam. But it was a very interesting moment for me of just how complex the Vietnam legacy is, and how hard it is to really relitigate in the current environment.
So I want to go around the table quickly and do a little bit of framing to get kind of your initial thoughts on the topic at hand. So, 50 years later, why are we here? Why are we still talking about Vietnam? Tell us, all of you individually, what your take is on, why this remains so poignant, both from a military perspective, from a policymaking perspective, from a broader cultural and historical memory perspective. Let's quickly go around. Celeste, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Usha. It's hard to think of express all of the ways in which Vietnam has this hangover even still today. But I think if you look at it particularly from the military perspective, and especially on the part of the Army, it's seen as this a bit of an embarrassment. And for some reason, the Vietnam legacy, I think, is hung around the neck of the Army much more than it is the other services, and partly that has to do with the Army being the senior command, at least in the South. And they were really determined not to ever have that happen again, that the Army would not be blamed again for, quote unquote, another Vietnam. And I think that pertained in the Iraq situation. And I think you still have some of that today that, on the part of the Army as an institution, we're not going to let that happen to us again.
Yeah, I agree with Celeste on the Army. I think that there are broad legacies of Vietnam in a number of different sort of arenas or fora that continue to affect American life. There are certainly legacies inside the military, not just for the Army, but for the Air Force, for the Marine Corps, even for the Navy. There are certainly legacies in the institution of the presidency, as Will reminded us. There are also legacies inside Congress. Congress learned lessons in Vietnam, and some of those are still with us today. And of course, there are legacies inside academia, inside the field of history and in the subfields of military and diplomatic history, to be sure, but also in the broader arena of university life, how students interact with administrations, and indeed how Americans think of students and their roles in public and civic life. So we can talk about all of those.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll approach the issue on a broader level. It seems to me there's two reasons why we're here today talking about this issue. One is that the United States remains, just as it has remained ever since 1975, a country prone to intervention internationally. And it's no surprise that the most searing, the most controversial episode in the long history of American interventionism abroad stands out as a point of analogy, a touchstone for evaluating subsequent debates over intervention, and then those interventions when they actually take place. So there's a policy reason why we're here, but there's also, I think, a social and cultural reason why we're here. Vietnam simply resonates so powerfully with ordinary people mostly who lived through it. But I would even say it has a little bit of a legacy that extends beyond that, even to people who sort of imbibe from our culture a sense that this is really important stuff. And this remains highly relevant, even if people don't have direct memories of it, which I think is one of the most fascinating things about it. But the war functions as a kind of proxy for a whole set of issues. Aaron touched on this in connection with students and universities, but it's a proxy for talking about the relationship between government and citizens, for talking about the obligation of people toward established authority, talking about the place of dissent in American society, talking about cultural change that we associate with the 1960s. So it's not only about military affairs. I think it raises a whole set of other issues that remain highly relevant to a lot of people who don't know much about the details of American intervention in Southeast Asia.
I think when I think about the continuing relevance and controversies of Vietnam, it boils down to this: is virtually every American would agree that Vietnam was a disaster, but we passionately, violently disagree why. And it's that intersection of those two, strongly held feelings, beliefs, what have you. So another recent illustration of this from the policymaking realm is in 2009, when the Obama administration was doing the big Afghanistan strategy review. He was newly elected president. This was one of his first priorities, to do a big review. And I was outside government by then, but watching this closely. And it became sort of the duel of leaked history reading lists, by which the opponents within the Obama administration of doubling down on Afghanistan, doing a new surge of troops, whatever it was going to be, including, on a web to Vice President Biden, all leaked to the press that they were reading Gordon Goldstein's book, Lessons in Disaster. And the key takeaway was not just that Vietnam was a debacle, but that the military had kind of led these unwitting civilians into this disastrous war. And so it was a kind of a historical shot across the bow at the Pentagon. Don't do that to us again. again. Meanwhile, a lot of folks at the Pentagon and a couple within inside the NSC who favored a more vigorous redoubling of our commitment to Afghanistan, a surge of troops, leaked that they were reading Louis Sorley's A Better War. Again, the main takeaway of which is, after the civilian leaders had messed up things in Vietnam, finally under General Abrams, we get the military gets the correct strategy on the ground right, and we're on our way to winning. But then the spineless civilians pulled us out again. Again, of course, the lesson there is a clear shot across the bow to the civilian leadership of the new Obama administration. Don't make that mistake again, too. So countless other examples we could give, but I thought that was a very vivid one of how we all have strong feelings about the war, but we very much disagree what those lessons and takeaways are. To delve a little more deeply into this, I want to start with some of the relevant history. So, Celeste, you've been doing some very interesting work on the Eisenhower administration. We usually don't associate President Eisenhower with Vietnam a whole lot. We think of Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon especially. Tell us why. What have you learned about Eisenhower and his administration's approach to Vietnam, and why we don't think about them much in the context of Vietnam today?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that, of course, the United States was providing France with financial aid during the Eisenhower administration. And, by 1954, somewhere around a third of the financial burden of the French fight in Vietnam was being borne by the United States. And 1954 in Dien Bien Phu was a very important moment for the U.S. to decide what to do about the siege that the French were experiencing there. And you can see some interesting
debates.
Just
clarify, the French forces were besieged by the Viet Minh, right? The Vietnamese communists.
Correct. So they were pinned down in Dien Bien Phu. It was geographically a terrible place for them to be. They were essentially below in a sort of dip in the geography, and so they could just have artillery rain down on them by the Viet Minh. It was a terrible situation, and a lot of Americans actually sympathized with the French and felt sorry for them. And so the Eisenhower administration had to ask themselves, well, what are we going to do about this, particularly since the French were coming to them and saying, hey, we need your help. We need you to undertake a bombing campaign. We need you to get us out of this. And so the interesting debate begins there in 1954, I think, and Mark may tell me that it happens before that. But what you can see is that the Army at this point is saying, look, this is a terrible idea. General Ridgway, who was the Army Chief of Staff, is asking his Army staff to look very carefully at the potential consequences of U.S. intervention there and reports to the president, this is a terrible idea. And essentially none of the chiefs, except perhaps General Twining, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff, and to some extent the chairman, Admiral Radford, nobody else was for coming to the aid of the French militarily.
On the Eisenhower theme that we started in on, I very much agree with the analysis that Celeste lays out. It seems to me Eisenhower is widely viewed by historians of the war as sort of an exception, right, to this long pattern by which the United States became incrementally more deeply involved. Now, Eisenhower does connect to that pattern in the sense that American aid for the French increased actually to 80% of the total support that was flowing to the French military forces. But there comes this really pivotal moment in 1954 when the decision has to be made, will there be intervention or not? And Eisenhower sort of uniquely in the long flow of American decision-making starting in 1945, probably all the way down to 1968 or 1969, opts against intervention. And so it's a fascinating question why, in that particular moment, given that particular leader, that decision was made.
I had the chance to visit the LBJ library yesterday, just down the street, which was a real treat. And, of course, the exhibit on LBJ in Vietnam is especially of interest. And, they have documents there from the early part of LBJ's tenure, basically talking about his reluctance to intervene. And of course, we all know how that story ended. And so I want to ask you guys about, we have this succession of presidents who seem a little worried about what's going on here. The American involvement is sort of getting deeper and deeper. Let's talk a little bit about whether, what the forces were that sort of drove this seemingly inevitable deepening of our involvement. Where were the inflection points where you think some of these administrations could have changed course, if at all? And talk a little bit about this interesting dissonance between what seems to be a reluctance on the part of presidents, at least in the early era, to get involved, and what eventually happened.
Right. So this is one of the big questions about Vietnam. Why did it seemed to matter so much to the United States that president after president, with the partial exception of Eisenhower, make a series of decisions that ultimately in 1965 land the United States in a major war. And there are a lot of factors, right, that historians have written about. I think most basically, historians have called attention to the simple fact of the idea of containment, which gets laid into place very early in the Cold War and shapes any number of American decisions thereafter. So one could certainly argue, as many historians have, that when LBJ confronted a problem that could no longer be resolved short of the actual introduction of American forces, he fell back on a logic that had by that point been around for almost 20 years, right? Communist aggression seemed to be taking place in Vietnam. Economic aid, military advisors, all of that had been tried for 20 years and failed. And now is the moment to do the next thing, sort of on the checklist of American options. So I think for many historians, that works as the principal explanation for American behavior. But it's been very interesting over many years now to see the additional arguments that various historians have offered. So domestic politics certainly matters. That is to say, president after president after president calculated that he would stand to lose in electoral political terms by failing to be seen as tough in standing up to the communists and losing a piece of global real estate to the adversary. Concern with credibility is also hugely important throughout this story. The economic interests of Japan above all, but of the United States more generally around the world is something that can also be pointed to as providing a kind of logic for deeper involvement over time.
Yeah, I think it's also important to think about how this narrative of presidents have to be tough and presidents can't give up and presidents have to be comfortable to using the violent weapons they have at their disposal. This is one of the legacies of Vietnam, and it's somewhat based on a myth. It's the so-called incrementalism debate, right? This comes out of the military quite strongly during and after Vietnam, that if you had just let us use all the tools in our arsenal and the amount of the tools that we thought was necessary, all of this could have been winnable, right? So first of all, it's a hypothetical, and that has problems. But let's be clear about Vietnam incrementalism. Yes, there are many years of advice and support to the French, advice and support to the South Vietnamese. By the time we're engaged in combat operations, the ramp up in Vietnam is anything but incremental. So the first year of the war, we put 164,000 troops in Vietnam. We more than double those the second year of the war. We put another 50% in the third year. In 1966 alone, the Air Force dropped 66 million pounds of bombs on North Vietnam. So the idea that this was an incremental buildup is just nonsense. I mean, by 67, there are more troops in Vietnam than in the entire active duty army today. So that is not incrementalism. Now, a story developed of Vietnam incrementalism that absolutely affected later military policy and continues to affect us today. So the Powell Doctrine, the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine, comes out of Vietnam saying, for God's sakes, if you're going to do it with overwhelming force, do it decisively, do it with an exit plan. Basically, it's lessons learned from Vietnam. So there is this narrative that comes out that we did not use enough force in Vietnam. I think that's an argument the Vietnamese would disagree with. But it continues to shape both Iraq policy and Afghanistan policy, and it becomes a political bludgeon in our political culture. If at any point there's an argument that you could have used more force, then there's going to be some opponent of the policymaker at hand that will make that argument. And that really removes any brakes on restraint in at least in the way we talk about wars. That's problematic, I think.
If I can add a couple of things here, and this is putting my historian hat on now rather than my erstwhile policymaker hat. And one of the things I think is important both intellectual skill and almost human dimension for historians to develop is empathy, is, trying to place ourselves in the eyes of the subjects we're studying in history and look at what did the world look like to them at the time. And I've made clear earlier, I do think that Vietnam was a disaster. We never should have gone in, certainly the way we did. But out of fairness to LBJ especially, a little bit at Kennedy, it's important to go back and look at what did the world look like in 63, 64. And two important factors there. The first is tremendous American confidence in our military, because at that point we had never lost a war in our nation's history. Okay, a couple of somewhat uncertain outcomes one could could point to, but certainly never an unambiguous, major defeat in a war, which gives us tremendous confidence that whatever we direct our military to do, it's going to be either reasonably successful or overwhelmingly successful. The second is what Mark alluded to earlier, the containment doctrine and communism. And remember, at the time, communism did look like a global monolith. At the time, the only split we are aware of within the worldwide communist movement was Tito and Yugoslavia, which was kind of, it was such a tiny little place, almost the exception that proves the rule. And, there had been a history of Soviet support for the Chinese communists. There had been a history of Soviet support for the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh. Now, we know now that the early seeds of the Sino-Soviet split were starting to take place during this time. And within a few years, of course, Nixon and Kissinger realized this and realized, global communism is not a monolith. But it at least was more strategically plausible at the time if global communism was our adversary to see what was going on in Vietnam as more of a first-order security concern. Again, to be clear, I think we are wrong, but it was not a completely irrational, implausible thing to think at the time.
Just to offer just some slight disagreement with my colleagues here, Aaron, I'm not sure that the military all thought, well, just, unloose the shackles, let us at it. We can take care of this if you let us, apply all the tools that we have. I think if you look at what the Army was saying in 1954, both Ridgway and General Gavin, who was in the Army G3 at that time, were saying, listen, the whole doctrine of massive retaliation, the whole idea that you can bomb somebody into submission is absurd. And so if you get yourself involved, you are going to have ground forces involved. It will happen. And Ridgway sends a group of Army experts to Vietnam to examine the ports, to examine the facilities, to see, okay, if we did this and we found ourselves having to put ground troops in, how feasible would it be? And he writes a very persuasive memo that he sends to the Secretary of Defense, and not trusting Secretary Wilson, he then sends it to President Eisenhower and says, look, this cannot be done. This place does not have the infrastructure that we would need. We would have to build it. And he actually says, and then by building it, you would then have to add forces to protect the people building the infrastructure, which I think is something we saw later. And so he sees very early that that incrementalism precisely is going to lead to ground forces, and that this is just a disaster in the making. And just one final point, in his book, Soldier, he says, when I meet my maker, mind you, this is before Vietnam, when I meet my maker, one of the things I'm going to be proudest of is that I persuaded the president not to get us involved in Vietnam.
Celeste points to something really important that I'd like to add to the discussion. It seems to me that among commentators and historians on the war who basically believe that the United States failed to make the right decisions to bring the war to a successful conclusion, that's a controversial point, but there's a big school of thought that feels that way. There's an interesting debate that occurs mostly among military analysts, it seems to me, between, on the one side, those who believe that the problem in Vietnam was that the United States didn't use enough force decisively and quickly and boldly enough. Harry Summers got that line of argument really rolling a long time ago. And then there's another school of thought that argues almost exactly the opposite. The problem was too much force, right? The problem was a failure to recognize that this was a war in the villages, a counterinsurgency kind of war that demanded a different type of American policy response. So too much force, too much firepower, too much bombing, whereas more special forces operating among the people in the countryside, winning hearts and minds, would have been the secret. And it seems to me one of the reasons that we're here today talking about this is that this debate hangs around in a very, very powerful way. In fact, in recent times, we've seen books making these arguments with a very presentist agenda, trying to influence policy in the 21st century.
Yeah, I want to drill down on this question of counterinsurgency and the lessons learned and not learned, whether in a policymaking capacity or as scholars or otherwise. When the debates over the Iraq War began, I'm curious to hear sort of what you guys thought was being imported from the lessons of Vietnam, and where perhaps you thought, we were displaying a little bit of collective amnesia and had to relearn the lessons. So I do want to go around and hear specifically regarding the Iraq War, how did the relationship between Vietnam and counterinsurgency impact the way that we waged that war, both militarily and politically?
I think it's important to start with the fact that when Iraq begins, it's certainly not a counterinsurgency, but it's filled with the same, I will say, naive, triumphalist ideology that we are coming to help people who want what we are bringing and are striving towards the same goals we are striving. That's true at the surface, but the devil was in the details, both with the relationship with South Vietnam and then certainly with, the defectors we were speaking to about toppling Saddam Hussein. So there's a real similarity in the way we thought about the people we were claiming to help, right? And I think that's reflective of certain optimism in American culture, but also, frankly, in some cases, a lack of empathy in understanding other people's lives outside the United States. Once we get into counterinsurgency operations, there are enormous similarities between the ways that we think about the military problems in Iraq and Afghanistan and the ways we thought about them in Vietnam. So the military, in the very difficult years when Will was at the NSC, the military retooled its entire approach to counterinsurgency, but that retooling was effectively to write a lessons learned from Vietnam. Right? The counterinsurgency manual is effectively, here's what went right, here's what went wrong in previous insurgencies. Let's not do the mistakes again. So it is directly trying to capture errors of Vietnam. That now the sad part of the story is that while that manual captured quite accurately things that went well and things that went poorly, when we attempted to implement them on the ground, other exogenous factors, political timelines, resources, and indeed our partners all got a vote. And the result is we did not actually correct many of the critical problems that were endemic in Vietnam. We can go into those later if you like.
I think the effect of the manual, that is to say FM 324, which was published in December of 2006, was much more rhetorical than it was tactical. And as someone who was there in 2006 and went and saw countless battalions and brigades out there in the field and, listened to what they were doing and saw what they were doing, it actually was not altogether different at all from what was stated in FM 324, but it was not working. And so, this story has yet to be fully told and told accurately. One of the big things that's missed is perhaps the story is always about Americans, right? What Americans are doing and whether what we're doing is effective or isn't effective. And there tends to be this kind of habit of ignoring the people that we're talking about. So what were the Iraqis thinking and doing? What deals were they cutting amongst themselves? And I think that story, we don't really know that story yet. And so we don't understand what actions they were taking that produced the outcomes that we saw. And so by focusing so exclusively on, U.S. tactics, right, wrong, it becomes then an American navel-gazing story rather than a full understanding of the overall strategic situation and what was changing other than our tactics, if they were changing at all. So I think that's one big issue with the kind of counterinsurgency narrative.
To chime in on this, I think the Iraq War is a really interesting case study of how inescapable Vietnam is, because back in the build up to an initial launch of the war, fall of 2002, spring of 2003, I think there's a pretty widespread assumption that this had nothing to do with Vietnam. The Vietnam syndrome was over. And remember, President Bush 41 had famously announced at the end of the first Gulf War, we have finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. And so in the build-up to the Iraq War in 2002, 2003, there's, I think, two different historical things going on, neither of which are related directly to Vietnam initially, but then it comes back. I'll explain that. So the first historical factor is, in some ways, a dramatic modification of the Powell and Weinberger doctrine. Because remember, the Powell and Weinberger doctrine was the governing paradigm for the Gulf War in 1991. Go in with overwhelming force, reasonable limited goals, and then a clear exit strategy. And that had largely worked for what it was, but now a little over a decade later, we still have this perceived Saddam Hussein problem. And so the sense was, all right, that doctrine wasn't enough to actually eradicate the Saddam Hussein problem. So that's why we know to go back and war again. But then the other governing paradigm, and this may seem like distant, naive history, but this is what the world looked like in fall of 2002. Afghanistan was seen as a success in the fall of 2002. And why was it seen as a success? Because we'd gone in with a light footprint. We'd gone in partnering with the local indigenous forces. We'd gone in doing some of our hybrid stuff, our CIA paramilitaries, our special operators, partnering with the Northern Alliance. And the assumptions were, don't go in with a large footprint because that will create local resentments. It's seen as the large occupying American occupiers again. And over time, it'll create local dependencies where the Afghan Afghans will rely on the Americans for their security rather than take it on their own. So that's why the Bush administration in 2002, 2003 does this weird hybrid designed to be a quick strike, light footprint operation in Iraq, but one that will take out what was seen as the root cause of the problem, Saddam Hussein. Now, of course, all of our listeners will know the sad rest of the story there, how those assumptions proved incorrect for the larger strategic goals. And then within a year of the invasion, the Vietnam ghosts are coming back. And that's when we start having all these other Vietnam discussions we've mentioned.
Well, that was a great answer. And I would build on it only by adding one additional historical moment that I think is relevant to this issue. And that is September 11th. It seems to me that, frankly, the radioactivity of the Vietnam War in American politics and culture had declined somewhat during the 1990s as a function of the end of the Cold War, the kind of end of the geopolitical circumstances that gave rise to Vietnam. I think you can see that in a variety of ways. I'm not saying it went away, but it was at a lower level, I think, than it had been at other times. And then along comes September 11th, which is, correctly understood as a sort of game-changing moment. And suddenly what's left of the Vietnam analogy, it seems to me, largely goes away. No one wants to talk, exactly as Will says, about Vietnam in that 2001, 2002, 2003 moment. It doesn't seem really relevant at a time when the United States had been, directly attacked. And I think this is very important. Now we can see in retrospect that even in that moment when no one was talking about Vietnam, there are all sorts of interesting parallels. Congress, just as in Vietnam, failed to ask the interesting and important questions in the run-up to war, right? Failed to exercise any control, very arguably, over some pretty dubious decisions. But, as precisely as Will and others have said, in 2004 or so, when things start to go bad in Iraq, suddenly Vietnam is back in a big way. Very good thing for historians of the Vietnam War. Suddenly we were all back in fashion. But I think 2004 really kicks off this new interest in Vietnam, and it really comes to a culmination point around the time Will mentioned earlier in 2006, 2007, when the surge was very much on the table. And both sides were using Vietnam to argue for or against the surge, I think, in very interesting ways.
I'd just like to make a quick comment. And that is about this issue of lessons learned. And I actually would be very interested in Aaron's perspective on this. It seems to me that we are all very quick to condemn, these our military institutions, especially the Army, for failing to learn. And this was the great cry: is the Army failed to learn from Vietnam, and that explains their disastrous failure in Iraq. And I think the whole process of how an institution of that size, and as complex as it is supposed to, quote unquote, learn a lesson from a prior conflict. Well, so is that not fighting the last war? So you want the entire institution to be focused on the previous disaster, and you want them to aim all of their efforts at, quote unquote, learning from this experience and then be ready for it when it comes the next time. And to me, this suggests, back to the empathy point, a complete lack of empathy for the people who were living in that moment, which is, wow, this has been a terrible disaster. We shouldn't do this again, much less focus on it. And oh, by the way, we have this existential threat called the Soviet Union facing us across the Fulda Gap in Europe. And isn't that actually a better focus for our efforts? And rather than let down the American people by obsessing over what we failed at, maybe what we should do is focus on the threat that we think is coming. And so it seems to me we're putting these institutions to some extent in a can't-win situation. Either you're fighting the last war, or you're failing to learn. So which is it?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Institutions don't learn, individuals do. Now, institutions can adopt best practices or have standards that come out of failures. And actually, I think that the military learned lessons from Vietnam much better than did civilians or policymakers. So a few quick examples. In Vietnam, we fight effectively 3 separate air wars because the Marine Corps, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force cannot agree on how to fight in the air. There are basic disagreements over strategy and tactics on the ground, particularly between the Marine Corps and the Army. That is no longer the case. The United States military is a fully joint organization. When it fights overseas, it is a mix of all 4 services in almost all arenas and combat functions. That's different. In Vietnam, civilians were largely seen as in the way or irrelevant to the prosecution of the war. Nobody viewed them as a strategic liability that could risk the overall mission if you killed too many. Obviously, that is a lesson learned. There is no way that you can look at the way the military treated civilians in Vietnam and the way that the military treats civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan and say that they have not changed. Finally, the press. There are serious problems in press relations with the military through Vietnam. The Department of Defense experiments through Grenada and Panama and finally lands on the concept of embedding reporters with frontline troops. And that radically changes how the press interacts with the military. So those are demonstrable changes that occur because of the senior leaders saying, wow, that didn't work well. Let's try something else. I think, though, that there's a second part to this, though. You're absolutely right that people, wars are upsetting and people like to point fingers when they don't go well. And so there's often this argument that says, you didn't learn or you've forgotten Vietnam, right? That is a common refrain. I don't think it's a fair comparison. There is something, just as an example of things that have not changed, of lessons that have not been learned. Even though policymakers reacted to the best information they had during the Gulf of Tonkin crisis, the fact that there was actually not 2 attacks, but 1, and we don't actually really know the intentions of the people who even made the attack, became a problem for the basic legitimacy of the war. The same thing happened in 2003 in Iraq. And so the military learned this lesson. They learned that they had had so many problems with credibility after Vietnam that no matter how ugly the story, they had to say what they knew, what they didn't know, what they think, but what they cannot say for sure. I'm not sure our senior policymakers have yet absorbed that, and it affects the legitimacy of the whole endeavor and actually has costs for the country and for the troops.
How did the institutions of the presidency and Congress change or not change as a result of the Vietnam War?
Well, I brought that up, so I'll just throw one out for each. There is a very powerful narrative that exists in Washington circles today that affected both the Bush administration and the Obama administration when I worked in it, that presidents cannot be too involved in the decisions pertaining to the direct use of force on the battlefield, the so-called picking targets or having target lists, right? So this was serious enough that in the early days of the Afghanistan war, President Bush, when presented some very serious targets and sort of early moves, just said flat out, I'm not picking targets. And Obama felt this was serious enough to actually offer caveats in his 2009 West Point address of saying, hey, this is not Vietnam. There are differences here, right? So presidents have learned that there is a cost when they actually appear to be directly involved in the application of force questions of the very forces they lead. That is a legacy of Vietnam that is still with us today. With Congress, there is a rather serious effort by Congress to question strategy and the purposes of the war in Vietnam. The Fulbright hearings are a national conversation. The War Powers Act is passed explicitly to say, you know what, Mr. President, we get a voice in foreign policy too. I think that I think September 11th is what changed this more than the specific conduct of the war on the battlefield. But congressmen seem to learn pretty quickly that questioning the president during an active conflict about the course of that conflict is a risky political endeavor. And I haven't heard any real serious criticisms or holding to account of presidents and the executive branch, even when they sometimes openly defy the will of Congress.
I think Aaron makes some great points, and I don't have a lot to add to that. I would certainly agree with him that in Congress, there's not a lot of evidence that sharp lessons were learned. And I think he's quite right in suggesting the best evidence for that point is a pretty persistent lack of willingness really to ask the difficult questions, to hold the military and foreign policy, national security establishment to account. You might well have assumed that something like that, a change mentality would have come out of Vietnam. But I think broadly speaking, it's not. And I think probably the effect, precisely as Aaron says, of September 11th was to lessen whatever inclination there might have been. And you can see occasionally across the historical record as a consequence of Vietnam. I think as far as presidents go, different presidents obviously have taken very different approaches. Their rhetoric has been very different surrounding Vietnam. But I do think that particularly since about 2006, 2007, one sees a much more pervasive recognition of the limits on American capabilities to do what it wants overseas. So in short, a resurgence of the Weinberger-Powell doctrine logic, even if those terms are not particularly present in the debate these days. I think in different ways, Obama and in some ways the Trump administration have emphasized, and for a variety of reasons, not just Vietnam, but the economic problems and all sorts of other reasons, have reverted to a pre-September 11th tendency to consider, some of what was at the heart of the Weinberger and Powell doctrines.
One of the things we haven't talked about much is the relationship between Americans and their military. And I do think there's an enormous Vietnam legacy here as well. And, I think people somehow absorbed the idea that service members were terribly mistreated during Vietnam, even though they were out doing their best. And these horrible people were spitting on them in airports and treating them awfully. I don't mean to minimize that at all. I just mean that we've kind of all absorbed that that's what happened. And so I think the response after September 11th was to go completely the other way. And Aaron uses the term, the very eloquent term, which he should coin, which is they achieved platinum citizenship after that. And so I think the public kind of said, well, we're not going to do that again. Whatever chuckleheads are out there guiding these guys and telling them to do things that aren't right, it's not their fault. And these people have heroically volunteered to be in our military. And I'm not being sarcastic about that either. I mean, they have volunteered, and they represent a very small percentage of the population. But I mean, I think you see in the way the public views the military today, it's being the opposite of what is perceived to have happened in Vietnam. So even still there, we have that hangover, that legacy of Vietnam in that relationship, and it persists to this day.
Just a couple of things to add to the very great insights from my colleagues here. The first is on the presidency. One thing that stands out for me is no American president wants to be one to lose another war, to unambiguously, unequivocally lose another war. And again, this was very key to understanding some of President George W. Bush's decision-making on the Iraq surge when we were in the process of losing this war. And he said this to us on the NSC staff. He later has said this publicly, and I think in his memoirs, when in the fall of 2006, when he was wrestling with different options, including the surge presentation, one of the concerns brought to him by the Joint Chiefs was breaking the force, the Army in particular. Like, look, we have real concerns that we are perhaps going to be breaking the Army with these unsustainable deployments and mismatch between ways, means, and ends in Iraq. And Bush took that very seriously, but his rejoinder was, I'll tell you what'll really break the Army is another lost war. And I saw that happen in Vietnam, and I saw the kind of generational long effect it had on our military, the Army especially. Of course, Celeste had some very helpful correctives here on some of the Army's lessons from Vietnam, but that's a big one. Then for Congress, again, going back to Aaron's good point that institutions don't learn, it's individuals, so it's hard to talk about Congress as an institution, but I will anyway. I think, by and large, Congress's record in Vietnam is appalling, and they get two fundamental things, I think, wrong. Here's where I'll tip my hand a little bit. The first, of course, is the blank check that they give the Johnson administration with Gulf of Tonkin. And then following on from that, of course, not exercising responsible oversight when the Johnson administration, I think, stretches Tonkin's powers almost to the breaking point. But the second is at the opposite end when, the post-Watergate Congress comes in, is elected in 1974, and we had made some pledges to our South Vietnamese allies, they still will an ally, that we were not going to cut off funding. None of our troops are there anymore, and yet Congress does. And that was severely damaging to America's credibility. It was severely damaging. I'm not talking about combat troops there. I'm just talking about, financial support and material for our ally. And it certainly hastened, I think, a lot of the horrible suffering of the South Vietnamese people. All right, pivoting now to kind of wrapping up our discussion here. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's try to return to one more big meta question, which we had started with. So for each of my interlocutors here, does a Vietnam syndrome still exist today? And if so, what is it, or what are its different expressions?
Well, I think what this conversation has revealed to me is that there's no doubt that a Vietnam syndrome still persists. If we mean by Vietnam syndrome that it still has an impact on everyone from policymakers to Congress, to the public, to the military, that the hangover is still there, the memory is still there. Now, the memory may not be accurate in all of those parties, or the memory may be different, or the understanding may be different, but it's still very much looming over the U.S. And I'm not sure when that we get over that, since a lot of the Vietnam generation is passing from the scene, but nonetheless, the Vietnam factor remains. And I'm not sure we'll ever get rid of it, at least in our lifetime.
I think, much as Celeste says, it absolutely still exists. I think that in the 1980s, something very interesting occurred in the way Vietnam gets understood and talked about that really lays the foundations for where we still are today in some ways. The Reagan administration and a resurgent conservative movement tried to kind of put the Vietnam genie back in the bottle, to get the United States beyond the Vietnam syndrome. And my read on what occurs in the 1980s is that Reagan in particular, the conservative movement more generally, was partially successful in that. And what we've had ever since is a debate, right, between people who are unconvinced by that reorientation of American thinking about Vietnam and others who went down that road of rethinking the war and trying to prepare the way for a more assertive United States. I think that's essentially where we are now. Whenever questions of interventionism arise, there is a substantial part of the American public and of the political establishment that is still inclined to raise all the doubts that flow from the Vietnam War. And like Celeste, I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. I think the real test will come as the Vietnam generation continues to move on. But I think it's going to remain precisely for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning of our time together. I think that Vietnam, quite separate from the actual historical reality of the story of the war, has this powerful place in our culture, much more so than the Iraq War. I don't think Iraq will replace Vietnam as the main analogy for U.S. interventions. And I think that has to do with the ways in which Vietnam has seeped into our politics, in our culture. Maybe the draft has something to do with that. More people were implicated in the debates over Vietnam than is the case with Iraq.
Unsurprisingly, I agree with all of my colleagues. Yes, a Vietnam syndrome still exists. And despite the sort of negative connotations of the word syndrome, I'd like to suggest that it's probably a good thing that it still exists. There are good elements and bad elements to Vietnam syndrome, right? The good elements of it are, let's be frank, right? When people talk about Vietnam syndrome, they talk about being hesitant or critical or pessimistic about overseas adventurism with violent force where American vital interests are not entirely clear. It is also a hesitancy or a pessimism about using guns and bombs and soldiers to try to support a foreign government as it defeats an internal insurgency. That's a kind of skepticism I want in our national conversation. So that's the good element of the Vietnam syndrome. There's also a number of negative elements as well. Basic distrust in the government comes out of Vietnam, then Watergate, and was only exacerbated by Iraq in 2003. Obviously, that's not good. I think it's one of the things that helped bring our current president into office. Another negative element is how there's sort of a bifurcation of masculinity that aligns by different job types. So if students are thinking and questioning a war, then they're being soft or they're being unpatriotic. If you're willing to just go stronger and use more force, you're being tough and you're being patriotic. That's an unhelpful framing. And I think that's a legacy, a part of the Vietnam syndrome that should probably go away.
Well, this is going to wrap up our podcast for today. Hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it. I think you've heard a wide range of views and insights on Vietnam and its continuing relevance for today. I think speaking from my colleagues here, we can all agree on Vietnam's certainly ongoing importance, its complexity, the need for further study of it, and also that we're going to continue debating it and talking about it for a long time. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.